Okay, so welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be another one of my news videos that I started off doing last week, similar sort of style. Half and half the article that I'm discussing and the topic that I'm discussing, and the other half is just my face. This video is going to be quite short. I think that this isn't a massive news story, but it is about a film that I'm interested in, and as such, it's one that I'm skeptical of because I believe that this film is going to be so hard to make. But on the other hand, I'm very excited to see what they do with it. I'm very curious. I want to know what this looks like. So let's just get right into it. The Death Stranding movie, which is based on the Hideo Kojima game of the same name, has found a director in Micheal Sarnoski. We'll get further into what he's done in the past, what he's known for. We'll get into all that as we go down the article. But I think it's probably right that we start this video off with talking about what Death Stranding actually is, as much as I can remember it. I was a big fan of the game when it came out, but that was maybe 4 or 5 years ago now. So I remember, I would say, the main themes of the game. I remember the idea behind it. I remember the concept. I remember the sort of main premise, I would say. But I don't remember the ins and outs of it, but also I don't think that is necessary for this video because I don't believe that they are seeking to make a one-to-one remake in movie form. As we'll talk about in this video, as we'll see in this article, I actually think what they're discussing is stepping away from the game and discussing someone else's story in the movie. Now, I might be wrong about that, but based on what they're saying, I think we're heading in that direction with this, which I actually think is probably the right decision because Death Stranding, the game, is already basically a movie. Hideo Kojima prides himself on his directing and writing work essentially being movie-like to the level of prestige movies. So I think it's more worthwhile that we either explore someone else's story in the Death Stranding, let's say in that apocalyptic world, or we explore apocalyptic event of the Death Stranding that caused the world to be the way that it is. And either way, I'm day one for this movie. I'm going to see this movie as soon as it comes out. This announcement to me just makes me that bit more positive about this film. So let's actually get into what Death Stranding is as a game, as a concept. So the idea of Death Stranding is that there has been some sort of apocalyptic event that has sort of, let's say, blurred the boundaries between the alive and dead. And it has sort of, in some sense, merged those two, but not completely. And the character played by Norman Reedus, who is the one that you see on your screen here, let's get a picture of him up. The character of Norman Reedus plays a guy called Sam Porter Bridges, and that name is deliberate in the sense that his role in this world is to, one, build bridges of connection between different people, between himself and the people that he delivers to, and then that brings in the second part of his name, which is Porter. He is a porter who makes deliveries of both people who can't go outside in this world and things to people. And so his role is, he is a porter who deliberately brings physical things, but he is also delivering a sense of connection to this world. That's a very weird sort of premise for an apocalyptic game, for an apocalyptic world. But it is also one that I think is it's almost so bizarre that it works. And if you understand who Kojima is, then you will understand that everything about him is that everything. If you understand who Kojima is, you will understand that everything about him is, in a sense, bizarre. But he understands how bizarre it is. It's so self-aware of how bizarre it is that it works. It's not attempting to deliver this stuff with a sense of seriousness but not understanding it's bizarre. It is serious and bizarre and understands that it is bizarre. And therefore, the ideas that Kojima attempts to convey in these games, like Metal Gear Solid, like Death Stranding, are so pervasive and hit you so hard because he is serious about his craft, that he isn't willing to explore bizarre ideas. So the main sort of themes that I think you can draw from this game are a sense of isolation, a sense of wanting connection, but there being something, an apocalypse, in your way that you physically can't bridge that sense of connection, or bridge that gap, I should say. And Death Stranding is obviously particularly poignant for the modern world, and Kojima meant it as such, as sort of a parable for the modern world and the sense of connection that so many people are desiring but can't sort of bridge because of their reliance on technology. And technology isn't ever present in this world. You never actually see a lot of the people that you're delivering packages to. You simply see a hologram of them who speak to you and tell you, can you do this for me? And I'll give you X. And therefore, I think that has to be the main crux of the movie as well. If the movie can't convey a sense of isolation, but a wanting of connection, then I'm not confident that this movie will be successful, at least to me as a fan of the game. What this movie has to do is understand that this is an isolated world, understand that this world is inhabited by people who want connection, but they simply do not know how to do so. And if the movie cannot convey that sense of isolation, it will be a failure. So I am interested to see if this movie can faithfully adapt that key element, that key theme onto the big screen, or if who they've chosen as director and writer in Micheal Sarnoski is so unaware of the material that he is adapting that he steps away from that. But let's now get into the article, because I don't think that is going to happen. So beginning at the top of this article, the article begins by talking about Micheal Sarnoski's third feature film that is currently in post-production, and it mentions what the film actually is. And again, this is a film that I'm aware of, and it gives us a sense of what kind of director Micheal Sarnoski is, even briefly, as we haven't seen that movie. We only have a brief outline of what the movie actually is. So his third feature film is a film called Death of Robin Hood, and this is being made at A24. The basic premise that I understand of Death of Robin Hood is that this film is about a fatally injured Robin Hood during one of his escapades, who is now on his deathbed and is slowly dying, and he is exploring, or reflecting, we should say, on his past life of crime. This is a darker adaptation of Robin Hood than we are used to, and this is something that I believe is written and directed by Micheal Sarnoski. So I believe that this is in some way his own idea, maybe based on a previous concept, a previous premise. But I believe he is writing this film as well as directing it. The idea of this movie is that Robin Hood isn't as much of a savior in this world as he is in other sort of adaptations of Robin Hood. And the idea being that the murder and the crime and the robbery that he has committed, he is now reflecting on, and he is considering whether or not it was worth it. This is an idea that I think immediately can be in some way poignant of isolation. It can focus on that sense of isolation. And I think that the figure of Robin Hood in general is quite a isolating figure. Yes, Robin Hood has his so-called merry men, but the merry men, in some sense, follow Robin Hood. They are his friends, yes, true, but they are also his followers. They are also, in some sense, a sort of cult that surround him and that support him in his fight against the Sheriff of Nottingham. And even in that sense of Robin Hood existing outside of the law is an isolating idea. He can't, travel into Nottingham. He can't go through Sherwood Forest without being constantly on guard about, am I going to be captured? Am I going to have to fight someone? Am I going to have to murder someone? Am I going to have to rob someone? And that idea I'm quite interested in. I'm interested in where can he take this character. Is this going to be something where it's a generic adaptation of Robin Hood that is just darker and actually doesn't focus on those elements as much? Or is this going to be a film that does focus in on that sense of isolation and that idea that Robin Hood isn't as good of a guy as we think he is, or at least in a reality sort of sense, he isn't as good of a character, as heroic of a character as we expect from him, as we expect from the mythical story of him. In a real sense, is he this isolated figure who is killing and robbing people for his own pleasure and merriment? And I think that's a particularly poignant idea, but it is one that we don't know as much about yet. It will be one that we will know about presumably soon, because as this Deadline article says, it's currently in post-production. So I think we should be getting a trailer for it this year, I would expect. And it's also worth mentioning, it mentions it later down, but Micheal Sarnoski is also, with this film, he is directing Hugh Jackman and Jodie Comer in the two main roles, or the two of the main roles. I'm not actually sure who they've cast as the Sheriff of Nottingham. I mention that now to say that he is someone who is well versed in tackling stardom. He is someone that seems to attract stars to him, and as I go on further in this, I will show you that he has managed more stars, more than just two. So that gives me some sense of hope. I expect Death Stranding to be a prestige product that will attract several big name stars purely for the name of Hideo Kojima. The people who are aware of him in Hollywood are people who all love him. I think that the premise of Death of Robin Hood is something that I'm really intrigued by, and the stars that they've attracted for this film, I think tell an interesting story of his ability to sell a premise behind a movie. So this is one that I am interested in very much, and I look forward to it a lot. And then the article goes on to say that Micheal Sarnoski will write and direct the Death Stranding adaptation, which I think is key, because this could have been a project that Hideo Kojima could have written. He could have directed. And I think it's so interesting that he will be a producer on this. He probably has some input on the writing and the directing of this movie. But I think it's so interesting that he's turned around to some extent and has said to Sarnoski, you make this. I want to see what you make and what input you can have on this world that I've created. I think that's so interesting. It's nice to see, to me, that this isn't being tackled by Kojima necessarily. And what I mean by that is, Kojima, as much as he wants to be a film director, he isn't a film director. He hasn't worked in Hollywood. He's worked adjacent to Hollywood in the sense that he's had a lot of Hollywood stars in his games over the years, but he isn't a Hollywood director. And again, as we'll see as I go through this article, Micheal Sarnoski has already worked in Hollywood. He has worked with Hollywood stars. He has worked with a big studio. He is someone that understands this industry, even in his infancy as a director. I think that he probably represents a bit of a bridge between Kojima and Hollywood, in the sense that he is a new director, so he isn't, he hasn't had his sense of style, as I see it, removed from him. He hasn't been Hollywoodized. He hasn't been introduced to the machine and mechanized to some extent. He hasn't done a superhero movie, for example. But he also, in my opinion, is a good enough director that he can helm a prestige product. And that in itself is enough to sell me on him. And again, as I go through this article, we'll see more of that. So this here, I've highlighted this, but this is basically just an encapsulation of what I've already said, which is that Death Stranding, blurs the boundaries between the worlds of the living and dead, bringing forth nightmarish creatures into a fragmented world on the brink of collapse. In some sense, it's meant to be a very literal metaphor for our own world, and I think that'll be something that, for those of you who haven't played Death Stranding, that you will see more in the movie. And actually, I just would point blank say you should play the game, because it is very good. It's an acquired taste, but I do enjoy it, I have to say. We come on to this paragraph, which I think is very interesting for people who haven't played the game. It might be a bit surprising. The game was played by more than 19 million people worldwide. This is a bit of a faux pas statistic, though, because they're saying it played. It was played by more than 19 million people, but that doesn't mean it was bought by 19 million people. Recently, the game was launched on some streaming services where you pay, like Netflix, you pay a streaming fee and then you have access to a library of games. The number isn't 19 million. I'm not actually sure what the number was. I would imagine it was probably around 10 or 15 million played and bought the game. And then around maybe 4 million to 9 million people have played it on streaming services. But 10 million for a game that is uniquely weird, I would say, is pretty worthwhile, in my opinion. That's not something to scoff at, in my opinion. It's a respectable number, I would say. 19 million or 10 or 15 is all pretty respectable, in my opinion. I don't think this was a game that Sony and PlayStation were exactly expecting to blow the barn doors off. But this is something that they want because they want prestige on their brand. That is something that Sony uniquely wants. That is something that they value in this space, is that they want to be seen as the premium prestige product that you can't get anywhere else. And then the second part of it that you might also find a bit surprising if you aren't aware of this game prior to the film being made, is that this film attracted major Hollywood stars. Norman Reedus, Mads Mikkelsen, Lea Seydoux, Guillermo del Toro, who is an actor. He acts in this game. He doesn't direct or anything. He plays a character in the game, which I think is so interesting. And Margaret Qualley. So he gets major stars. The game was, I think, coming off of the back of Mads Mikkelsen being in Hannibal. This was just a few years removed of that. Lea Seydoux, this was in the middle of her doing the two Bond films, I should say. Norman Reedus was still on The Walking Dead. He's arguably the biggest star at this point. Guillermo del Toro, well-known Hollywood director, established, unique in sort of the auteur space, is producing stuff that I don't think anyone else is producing things like him. He's very unique in what attracts him to films. And then Margaret Qualley, who I would say since this film has had a bigger career. She probably has had the biggest film of her career so far last year in The Substance. That's, I think, probably her biggest role to date. And like I says, Hideo Kojima just attracts Hollywood stars. I don't know how he does it, but he does it exceptionally well. In some sense, as I say, I'm expecting this film to attract at least 2 or 3 big, well-known stars. I'm actually interested in whether or not the film brings back any of these, actors for a live-action role. I don't think they will, because as I say, I think they are going to shift into a different direction. Although I wouldn't be surprised if they did, in terms of a sort of peripheral role. Maybe have someone like Guillermo del Toro or Margaret Qualley in one scene, and they're not the main cast. Norman Reedus, Mads Mikkelsen, and Lea Seydoux. They're more sort of characters that are prevalent, I would say. And so I wonder if someone like Margaret Qualley would be in it for maybe just a scene or two. I don't think she's exactly rushed off her feet as much as I love her as an actress. I think she's a great actress. But I'm expecting some big actors to be drawn to this project. But until we have a more concrete idea of the premise behind this film specifically and what they're looking for, I don't think we can really say who will be in this, because we don't even have an idea of who the characters are going to be. But someone to the level of... I don't think it'll get a Leonardo DiCaprio. I don't think it'll be someone as big as that, because even Leo still works with premier directors, and he doesn't really do the A24 indie house. But maybe... You know what? I'm not actually going to speculate, because I don't have an idea. I would need to think on it more. And the issue is that Death Stranding as a concept is so unique and abstract from pretty much everything that currently exists in Hollywood. that I'm not really sure how to cast the movie. I think it's one that is really, really difficult. It is one that I think you need a premise and a script for before you can cast it, because I think you have to be looking at specific actors or specific characters. I think you need to be casting actors in terms of going, okay, I have this role, so I want this specific actor. I don't think it's one that you go, anyone can do this. I think this is a film where you need to be writing characters for specific actors, or with specific actors in mind, and possibly a second and third backup choice. I don't really know how to talk about this section because, like I said, I think this will attract heavy hitters, but I don't know who those heavy hitters are yet. Even if it's a case of A24 and Micheal Sarnoski and Hideo Kojima turning around to someone like Margaret Qualley and Norman Reedus and Mads Mikkelsen and going, we really want this person in the Death Stranding movie, and we know you're connected with them. Can you let them know what this is about? I think that sort of thing happens all the time, obviously. I think that's how, first-time directors get films made. But again, I'm just not sure of who I think is going to be cast in this. And then the last little bit that I want to talk about, and the reason why I actually am pretty optimistic about this, is because I think that they have got the director choice correct. And the reason why I think that is because if we look at, as this article says, Sarnoski has already worked with big name actors, and he has already worked with one major IP, an IP that actually I would say probably made more money than Death Stranding the game. His featured debut in 2021 was the critically acclaimed film Pig, which starred Nicolas Cage. So if you haven't seen this film is, I will say this film is pretentious. It is, like, no doubt about it. But Death Stranding is also pretentious, so I don't see an issue with it. And I don't think pretentious in this sense is a insult, as a lot of people have it. I think pretentious in some cases can be used as a compliment or just a sort of an adjective, let's say, to describe it, like, sort of neutrally. And what I mean by that is Pig wants to be pretentious. It is trying to tell you something, like, pretty directly. Death Stranding is trying to tell you something directly. It's trying to speak to you, the player. It's trying to speak to you, the viewer. It's not for people who aren't going into the film expecting a message. It has a message to disseminate. It is there to serve its point. And if you don't agree with its point, or you think it's too up its own arse, you just won't enjoy it. I personally enjoyed it quite a bit. I thought it, as the film goes on, it gets a bit too unbelievable. The idea that this chef is so well known in the city of Portland that, like, everyone is like, oh my god, he's back. I was like, okay, that's a bit too pretentious for me, but also I can respect it, and I can respect him sticking to his vision so completely. You can tell that this is a film that he just envisioned how it comes out on the screen, and he isn't exactly changing it for anyone. I think in some ways, Sarnoski as a director understands that there's a bit of pretense to it, but he isn't really shaken by that. He has a point that he wants to disseminate, and he sticks with that completely, which I really respect. But the main thing about Pig and A Quiet Place Day One, which is his second film, which came out last year, the main thing about these two films is that he is, and I should say, by the way, he doesn't just direct A Quiet Place Day One, he actually wrote that film as well, which I was really impressed by, because I assumed that it would come from a script from John Krasinski. So the fact that Krasinski trusted him enough to go, okay, write it and direct it, I think is really impressive, which is why I think that the Death Stranding movie will be much of his own idea, because he has history of adapting major IP and making his own, or placing his own spin on it. So the thing that is most convincing to me that he is the guy to adapt this is that in both Pig and A Quiet Place Day One, he is able to convey very effectively this idea of isolation and the desire to have connection, but not knowing how to overcome the obstacles in your way. So the main obstacle in Pig that Nicolas Cage encounters in his like quest to forge connection, chiefly with Alex Wolff, who I think is quite good in the movie. The main obstacle is the death of Nicolas Cage's wife, which you only learn about halfway into the film. But you get the sense that Nicolas Cage's character in the film basically had a mental breakdown and sort of disappeared from his Portland life, and he just went into the woods. And the thing that he does now is he has a pig that is able to find truffles, and that's his life. He just lives with his pig, and that's it. He basically survives by finding truffles, and that's it. And obviously, the sense of isolation there is pretty, on the nose. It's not something that is attempting to be subtle in what it's trying to say. It is meant to be, pretty on the nose. It's about forging connection through isolation and how you need to connect with people in order to feel alive to some sense, and how people can only overcome grief through sort of connection. You need people around you to overcome connection or to overcome grief, or else you will just sort of wallow in it. And Pig is a really impressive debut feature for me, but the main thing about it was that I was struck with the sense of isolation that he is attempting to convey and the need for connection. And on that movie alone, I was like, all right, I get why he's the guy that I understood why immediately he was the guy that they've hired for Death Stranding, because it makes complete sense. But then going into A Quiet Place Day One, and I should say I watched both of these movies to make this video. I hadn't actually seen both of them. They had sort of passed me by. But then I was somewhat confused as to why he made A Quiet Place Day One, because I was like, okay, I can sort of see how it's about isolation, but it's a lot more of a tentpole movie. It was an established IP with 2 previous movies at that point. So I was like, okay, how's it going to convey in this major IP? Is it going to feel... Is that message that he's trying to convey going to feel lost in this sort of IP that needs to have spectacle to it, that needs to feel like its previous or like its predecessors in certain ways? And I was actually pleasantly surprised by how much of the movie focuses on that sense of connection and that sense of isolation. The main character, Sam, in A Quiet Place Day One, played by Lupita Nyong'o, suffering from cancer. And then Joseph Quinn's character in the movie is separated from his family, who are back home in England, and he's in New York City, obviously. And what was really impressive to me is the ballsiness of focusing on a cancer patient at the center of this apocalypse movie, because I sort of was thinking about it and going, okay, well, why are you focusing on a cancer patient? Because there was sort of a doom and gloom aspect to it for me, where I was like, she's not, even if she makes it out, she's in a hospice at the start of the movie. She might make it out of New York City alive and escape, but she's not going to make it much longer than that. And the movie is very upfront with that by placing her in a hospice. And what the movie actually conveys to you very effectively, and the most effective part of the movie to me, is that she's not trying to make it out. She's just trying to go out on her own terms. She just wants to do one last thing, and then that's it. She'll accept her fate. And that's really poignant to me. And the sense of connection comes in. And obviously, she feels isolated because she has cancer. And that is a pretty isolating experience, because you feel like the people around you don't understand what you're going through. So that was pretty upfront to me. The sense of connection comes in when Joseph Quinn's character is sort of like, I can't leave this woman alone. She might die soon, and would I want her to be alone for her final moments? And that was a pretty convincing idea to me. It might seem far-fetched to some other people, but to me, it was pretty believable. So this is a director to me that seems very interested in themes of isolation and connection, and how we overcome isolation through connection, how we overcome ideas like grief and loss through connection, and how, as much as we as individuals might want to be isolated, it is actually only through connection that we can overcome the obstacles in our life. So he is someone that I am pretty convinced that he is the right guy for this movie. And although he is relatively unproven still, he is still very new in this industry. I am willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, and I am willing to believe that he can deliver on this property. It is just a matter of saying how much he gets in the way of a budget. This needs to be a movie that is at least 50 million, if not upward of 60. It remains to be seen what A24 gives him in the sense of budget and what they give him in the sense of a cast. But this will need to be one that, in my opinion, has a bigger budget, or let's call it a B movie level budget, like I said, 50, 60 million. And it needs to be a cast that has a couple heavy hitters, because they're going for prestige with this. They're going for Oscars. That's what Sony wants. That's what Hideo Kojima wants. He wants Oscars connected to his properties. So this needs to be of a B level movie budget, and it needs a director who is interested in themes like isolation, like connection, and it needs a well-known cast. The budget in the cast remains to be seen, but I think they've got their director who is interested in prestige. So, in my opinion, this is the first correct decision with Death Stranding. So, I'm going to leave it there. This video has actually been quite long, I think. But this is something I'm interested in. This is something that I think they've gotten correct. I'm really excited to see how this movie comes out. And like I say, it, in my opinion, is looking positive. There's still a lot that remains to be seen. Death Stranding is a really hard property to sell to people. It's a really hard property to adapt. Even the first game is hard to understand. So there's a lot going against it, but I am positive off of the back of this decision. So if you like this video, subscribe, comment, like, all that sort of stuff. There's socials in the description. Thank you for watching. See you later.